the denouement. All right. So let's recap the first couple of weeks. How did we get to where we are? Week 1, everybody that was here remembers, it's the first 2 chapters of Esther. And the main points were that you didn't see God in it. He worked silently. There was no miracle, there was no prophet, there was no angel, any of that stuff. He just worked through the circumstances, and he removed we're talking about Persia, which was the biggest empire of the day, biggest empire in the world probably to that point. And he just worked silently to position Esther as the queen. And he did it through just normal circumstances. The queen did something, the old queen did something the king didn't like and kicked her out. She gets raised up from nowhere of all of the people in the kingdom to become the queen. Again, not a miracle, but the thread of him positioning her. Also, her cousin Mordecai, who's a big part of the story, and he's a big part this week too, is an integral part of the first couple of weeks. He saves the king from a plot against him and tells Esther, and Esther tells the king. And they record the information, but there's nothing done for Mordecai at the time. So he's kind of, I did this, and what was the purpose, right? Well, we're going to find that out. Then in week 2, that was a tough one last week. We talked about courage at the crossroads. We talked about how Esther had to make a decision. Most people think that the key verse in Esther is 4:14, which is for such a time as this. Who knows, Esther, if you were raised to be queen for such a time as this? And that is a critical thing to know. But the real question is, what did she do with that? And she made a decision in 4:16, and she said, if I perish, I perish. If I approach the king without him giving me permission, often that doesn't go good for whoever does it, including the queen, which had already been removed, right? But she chooses the courage of walking in there not knowing how she'd be received. So she had to show not just obedience, but courage. So we talked about obedience and courage. And at the point of the end of last week, she had made the approach. Haman had built the gallows because Mordecai was his mortal enemy and all the Jews were, to hang him. And we were kind of left hanging at the end of chapter 5. So we don't really know what's going to happen, and Esther didn't know either. She approached, the king did allow her to approach, but she had no idea how this was all going to be resolved. So we'll talk about that this week. So what we're going to see this week is what God was doing all along and how he brings about deliverance to complete the salvation of all his people. Remember, all the Jews were at risk here. In the whole empire, there was that decree that was put out that the Jews were going to be destroyed on the 13th day of the 12th month. It wasn't the 13th of December because our calendar's different. It was probably in the spring. The 13th day of the month of Adar, which was in the Jewish calendar and in the Persian calendar. So at this point, it all hangs in the balance. So let's pray and move into this week's, which is how God works in ordinary circumstances, but in extraordinary ways. There's some things that happen here that are pretty amazing. So let's pray. Father, we just pray that you would open our hearts and our minds. Everybody comes in here in a different place. We come in after good experiences this week or tough ones. We come in situations where we're just full of faith, and sometimes where we're really down, and faith is a long way away. And so, Lord, we just pray you speak to all of us right where we are. You always do it. And so whatever one person hears to apply might be different than someone else. But we just pray you be working even in this, through your Spirit in us, to apply this to our lives and not just make it a story about people 2,500 years ago. So, Lord, this time is yours, and we just pray for your wisdom. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So how does God work at the beginning of chapter 6? We're going to look at 6. Now listen, there's more scripture in this than in the previous 2 weeks. It's the same amount as the first 2 weeks put together, but we'll summarize most of it. I'm just going to read a few key verses here and there. But let's set the stage for where we stand. So last week at the very end, two things happened. Esther had approached the king. He said, yeah, come on, what's your request? And she throws a banquet for him and for Haman, who was his second in command, who was also a real enemy to the Jews and had convinced him to do that decree to exterminate them later, in the year. And so that had happened, and Haman had been all happy about it. Even the queen acknowledges that I'm the second in command. He's just full of himself. We talked about pride in this empire and in the whole world. Pride is a thing. So he goes home full of pride, but he sees Mordecai on the way home, and it just enrages him. Because even though he has everything in the world, the one thing still sticks in his craw, and that's Mordecai. So he goes home, and his family encourages him to build a gallows, which is those big things that, the floor drops out and people hang. So Haman has one of those built after this first banquet that was that day, and then overnight has the gallows built. And here's what happens that night. There's another banquet for Haman and the king the next day that Esther had already planned. So as we stand there, thanks for this, Tim. Still have it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It comes up at the oddest of times. Esther 6:1-3. During that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order. Let's just think about that for a minute. The whole turn of the series, the beginning of the denouement, which again, this is not working. I don't know why. Here it goes. The whole thing hinges on a sleepless night. How many of you all have had a sleepless night lately? Happens to me once or twice a week. I'll go to sleep at 9 or 10, and I wake up at 2 o'clock, and that's the end of it. And I'm up and I'm rolling around the rest of the evening, right? Well, that happens to the king. Now, have you all ever had a situation in your life where a sleepless night happens and God starts talking to you, and he'll reveal something to you, or he'll give you maybe what to do tomorrow, or who you need to contact, or bring somebody to mind that you pray for, or whatever. You can name a million things. That's not an uncommon occurrence. Half of us raised our hand. Probably more of us it's happened to, right? But on this particular night, for the king to not sleep, it was something special. So God worked again in the silence, just through the fact that the king can't sleep. So during that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. You remember at the very beginning what happened, right? In the first chapter, the second chapter. It was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on the king. So the thing that happened years before, this isn't like a week ago, this is like years before. They recorded it. They didn't do anything for Mordecai. It just sat there. And we were like, it seems insignificant. So the king says, hey, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So he did this great thing for you. We recorded it, but you never said to do anything, so we didn't do anything. So let's see. I don't want to read the whole thing. But I will say this, if God had wanted to show up dramatically, have an angel hover over the bed and wake him up and speak to him, he could have done that, right? He can do it however he wants. But he just works through the king not being able to sleep and going to read chronicles of things that had happened years before on a sleepless night, right in between banquet 1 and banquet 2. Is that God's hand? Absolutely it is. It's hidden. It doesn't seem that significant that he can't sleep, but look what happens in the midst of it.
I'm impressed that the eunuchs knew that nothing had happened and been done.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. If you remember back in chapter 1 and throughout this whole series, there's this concept of favor. It said that the main eunuch over the harem and the ones that were coming before she was named queen, they were brought in from all over. But it says that Esther had found favor. And then we saw 2 more times in the same chapter that she had found favor. So even all those years ago, God was positioning Esther in the place, but also the eunuchs, which probably all worked together she had favor on. So they remembered things about her that they wouldn't remember about just the average person. And again, it comes up way later on. I didn't really write that in here, Tim, but that's exactly right. So this kind of closes the loop on the insignificant stuff. So it doesn't seem that way. A forgotten act is remembered, but God's work remains silent. So the application here is simple. I mean, I don't think there's anything in here this week that's super earth-shaking. But just don't discount the good things that God has you do for people as you walk through your day. Might have been from years ago. You walk into a Speedway and you say something nice to the lady at the counter. Maybe you share a verse or you share a story about what God's done in your life. And then you just walk on with your coffee or whatever. It can be any number of things, right? But they seem insignificant, but you don't know what God does later and what he does to use that in the thread of what he's building. So I think part of the application here is just simply do what God calls you to do, the obedience that we talked about last week, because he often uses things in ways we can't imagine. There's no way Mordecai could think, based on that event that he did, what was going to happen in this story this week. So he still works in the silence, and the key for us is just that obedience, to even courage if we need to do what he calls us to do. All right. So the first reversal. Think about this for a second. Remember from last week, I told you he had built that gallows. Haman had built the gallows he was planning to hang Mordecai from it. So not 12 hours later, just a sleepless night, he starts to reverse the story. If you look at the rest of chapter 6, and I'm not going to read it all, but the king says to the eunuch, this Mordecai guy, I should probably do something. Who's out in the court? Who can I get to help with this? Well, Haman had showed up for the banquet. So Haman shows up, and he's like, yeah, it's funny. It is. It's ironic. I don't know if I'd call it. It's not funny for Haman. So Haman shows up, and the king calls him in. And the king says, in verse 6, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? What should we do for somebody if I want to honor him? Well, what's Haman's first thought?
It's me.
It's me. So let's see, what would I really like? I think what I would like, king, he doesn't say it that way. If you want to really honor somebody, you should put your robes on them. You should put them on your horse. You should put all your princes around them, and you should parade them through the square. That's what you really ought to do. And he's probably preparing in his mind to go put the robe on. It's funny. It's okay to laugh. So what happens? Look at verse 10. This is their enemies. The king said to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horse, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said. So the first thing that Haman has to do when he's planning on hanging him is honor him. That morning, the very next morning. That's a reversal, right? So Haman had planned this for his death, but he has to honor him instead, and his pride, begins to fall.
There's another thing there. He calls Mordecai not Mordecai, but he calls him Mordecai the Jew.
Yeah, he does. I never really noticed that, Tim, and that's going to probably alter what I say coming up. But let's hold that thought and figure out how that's going to work. I guess they probably wrote it down in the Chronicle, because Esther hasn't revealed the whole Mordecai connection and all that. We'll get to that in a minute. So it must have been in the Chronicles, who he was, and like in chapter 3 when we introduced Haman. Remember, it was Haman the Agagite. So people were often identified with who their lineage was. So because they didn't have first and last names, maybe they wrote that down. That's a good point. So there's a verse in Proverbs 16:18. I didn't put it up here, but you all heard this before. A lot of people summarize it as pride comes before a fall. What it actually says is pride comes before destruction. Well, guess what's happening to Haman? It's starting to fall. It's not totally gone yet, but he's down a notch. He's not necessarily maybe second anymore because, Mordecai's parading around with the robe and the horse and everything. So again, remember that insignificant things from before often get used by God in ways you can't imagine. There's no way that anybody could have imagined this story. And he still works in the silence. How many small things has he used in our lives before? Like I said, a conversation with somebody. You ever had a plan and it got delayed? You wanted to do something and then it doesn't happen for a while? Well, is that a coincidence, or is that God's hidden hand saying, look, you're not ready for this. There's something better for you, but it doesn't happen till here. So I'm not saying no, I'm just saying later. He does that. I told you the story in week 1 about how I was going to graduate early from college and I was going to end up in Alabama. And if he hadn't given me mono and strep and had me drop out for a semester, I wouldn't be married to my wife. I wouldn't have 5 kids and 5 grandkids so far, and I wouldn't be here talking to you all. And that happened 42 years ago. He delayed and changed my plan through ordinary things. I just got strep. I just got mono. Kids in college get those things. And it just changed the whole trajectory of my life that I didn't even see at the time. I had no idea. And you all have stories like that too. Mine's not a major, thing. It's just how God works in our lives. So he often just works, has he ever worked you guys in a job change where you lose a job and you're just down and the next one you get's even better? And it's in a better position, that's just God's hand weaving through our lives and bringing us to the point he wants us to be, positioning us for what's next. And we can't see it. So we have faith and trust even when we don't see it. So what happens next? That's kind of the first reversal is, the insignificant stuff came back to light and became very important. And the beginning of the downfall of Haman and the rise of Mordecai has begun. But remember, while we're still moving through here, it's a couple more slides before we get there, but all the Jews are still under a death sentence. There's nothing that's been done to solve the big picture problem yet. It's just things are starting to move into place. The denouement is beginning, right? All right.
Hey, Dan, can I just,
Yeah.
this is just something that I've never, I'm just reading again now, that when Haman went back to his wife and his friends and said, oh my gosh, here's what's happened.
Yeah.
I thought that interesting, the last verse of chapter 6, when his wife basically says, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him. And I love that because they, even though God's not mentioned, they know the history of how God always rescued
That's very good.
his people.
Yep. That's right. Yeah. She knows that this is not a good sign because,
It's gonna end well for you.
and probably for me too. She doesn't say that. And we'll see later on that it doesn't end well for him and for them.
Yeah, I feel like too, she doesn't mention God by name.
Right.
It's
But it's there. They know the reputation of the Jewish God. And they know that if he shows up in a situation like this, it's not good for the enemy of the Jewish God, right? And the Jewish people.
Hey Dan?
Yeah.
I have a question concerning this interlude. With after the first banquet, Esther could have easily asked to have that thing removed because he was already promised even up to half my kingdom, and
Yeah.
the Jews won't have the kingdom.
Right.
Why do you think that God told her to pause and just have another banquet, or do you think she was just like, I don't want to ask right now, so let's have another banquet?
Let's talk about that in just a minute, because I got it. And if I don't answer it and it doesn't make sense, just ask.
Okay.
Yeah. So where are we? We're still at the very beginning of this one. Okay. So Esther in chapter 7, verses 3 through 6. This is the second banquet. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther, the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you, and what is your request?" So this is the second time he's asked, right? And the queen says, look at verse 3. I'm going to read through verse 4. I only said I'm going to read through verse 3. I'm going to read verse 4 too. Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight," that word favor keeps coming up. It's not done. "And if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request." So this time she does say, look, my request is that you don't destroy all my people and me. And look at verse 4. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed and to be annihilated." Now, if we had listened to this is the humility part. I love this. I'm going to have to circle back at my notes, but I'm going ahead. "Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent. For the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king." So she's saying, listen, if this wasn't utter destruction of me and my people, I wouldn't have even brought this up. But our lives are on the line here, and I have to. You want to talk about humility. You know, we talked about courage last week, and this kind of, I'm not quite there, but we'll get there. But, you know, she approaches him not even knowing if I perish, I perish. She doesn't even know if he's going to point the scepter at her and even let her come, or just off with my head, right? But she approaches, and he asks what her request is, and she says, well, I just want to throw you and Haman a banquet. I just want to honor you. And then she does it again. And at the end of last week, after the first banquet, I don't think she still knew. I don't think she knew what her overall plan was. She just knew, I think, in her spirit, now wasn't the time. And on day 2, the second banquet, I think she senses, okay, he's asked me a couple of times. Now I can approach him and ask. But even then, it's not like, you just promised me half of the kingdom, so here's what I want to do. I want you to revoke that decree. I want you to save my people. I want you to kill that guy. I want you to do this. I want you to do that. She approaches again with, if you had only passed a decree to put us into slavery, I wouldn't be saying anything. But since it's life or death, I have to. That's a humility. That's a wisdom that runs through this whole courage that Esther has shown. You know, I'm skipping way ahead. It's okay. A lot of times, you know, we think of courage as like an immediate rush to action. And sometimes it is. I told the story last week about my uncle in World War II that drove the boats that dropped the soldiers to run onto Normandy Beach. And he was in a lot of danger just going back and forth because there's bombs dropping everywhere. But he drops that door, and those guys, those kids, have to charge. Well, that's an immediate rush of courage, right? But in this case, she uses wisdom and calmness and just an amazing restraint. And all I can say to that, Sean, is that she must have just sensed that there was a time and it wasn't the time. I don't know if God, through some revelation, told her today's the day. You know, when the king was having a sleepless night, maybe she was too. It doesn't say. But somehow or another, she knew. So here's the whole thing. Let me try to catch up with where I'm at. I don't know exactly where I'm at. So Esther finally reveals who she is. She's like, look, me and my people, you've issued a decree against us. So yes, I'm a Jew. She also, like I said, used humility and wisdom. And then the last part, which I haven't read, but I'm fixing to read it. This part I love, kind of the analogy of the thing. She fingers Haman as the culprit. So in verse 5, the king says, who is he? And where is he who would presume to do this to you and your people? Who in the world is the culprit here? Can you just imagine your Haman sitting there? Oh my gosh, I thought my enemies, the Jews, were powerless. I thought Mordecai and all them were an insignificant part of this kingdom and no big deal. The whole time the queen's sitting here as my enemy and I didn't even know it. And boy, did she play it good, because he doesn't have a chance at this point. He's already cooked. But the first realization for him is, uh-oh, there's some fear, right?
And what's
So-
with the king, you know? I mean, he signed the edict that, and
It was done it was done months ago. I
Yeah.
mean, it's,
It
I
also
don't,
could have been that he's thinking, oh, whoops, you know, I didn't know she was a Jew.
I mean, if you're a king.
he
how
sounds
many-
like he was an idiot, you know?
Well, we talked at the beginning about there was vanity and stuff, but there was also a weakness underneath it. You know, some of it could be that, but I tell you what else it could just be. When you're a king or a president or a leader of a gigantic company, do you know how many things pass in front of your desk on a daily basis? And you have advisors that tell you certain things, and you can't dig to the details of every one. You just can't do it. I mean, even in my job, which is a, middling kind of job, I make probably dozens of decisions every day. And most of them, I trust the people that work for me or with me that are the expert in that area to just make them. I think he just wasn't thinking. And it's just like, this is the 87th decree of the day. There was a decree about garbage collection in province number 7, and there was this decree, and there was that, and he's just, okay, fine.
He also
And somebody like Haman could certainly be a deceiver, right?
Well, all of the advisors all advisors in almost everything, not all, that's wrong. There are advisors in every walk of life that have their own agendas, and they bring it before you as if it's a good idea for you, but it's really a good idea for them. So, I mean, the court was filled with those people, including him.
There's also the fact that he delegated the search for a new queen completely to somebody else. And it didn't matter to him what the nationality was, just as long as she was pretty.
Right, that she fulfilled the role that he wanted a queen to fulfill. She's pretty, he could parade her. You remember
Yes.
the previous queen because she didn't parade when he told her to.
Yeah.
Vashti was her name.
Also, if they hadn't had the second dinner, then all this with Mordecai wouldn't happen, with honoring of Mordecai.
That's right. So the whole thing, again, you could never orchestrate this in human effort. God's never really mentioned, but there's no question his hand is through the whole thing, and the timing is perfect. That sleepless night was not 3 months ago. It wasn't 2 days ago. It was that very night. And it's just how God works. And you can't, even as much as we, do hear and know the Lord, and compared to most people, we can't see it. We're human too, and he doesn't reveal it all. He reveals it in his time. So that's what he's doing here.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
So to Tim's question about why the king seems to flip-flop on this.
Uh-huh.
The key point through this whole thing is when the king finds favor with somebody, he grants them a request.
Mm-hmm.
So when, Haman found favor with the king, he was elevated to a high position, and then he made, what can I do for you? I've honored you this way, so what's your request? And Haman's request was eliminate the Jews.
Right.
Which at that point seemed to be insignificant to the king.
Right, it's like,
Okay.
who cares,
got that.
right?
But now he's honored Mordecai, who's a Jew. And Esther reveals her something. He's honoring her. She's found favor with him. So he's granting their request now.
Mhm.
And it trumps what he had granted
Yeah.
to Haman in the first place.
It just occurred to me, this is a terrible thought, I'm going to say it anyway. Haman was number 2, and he ends up in number 2. Yeah? Why does that come to my head? I don't know. I don't know that that's necessarily inspired.
You're a boy.
Yeah. It's just one of those things. All right. So verse 6, verse 5, the king says, who would possibly do this? Well, the person who would possibly do this happens to be the other one being honored. And the only other one in the room beside, I guess, the queen and the eunuch or whatever. Verse 6. She just she doesn't say that she points at him, but you can just see her. That guy sitting right next to you, that one. A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. One sentence, just bang. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Well, no kidding. That's not a good position to be in. Number 2 to the kingdom, in the kingdom to, I'm in trouble here. I mean, I put myself in Haman's shoes, even though he's not a likable fellow, and I think, what a day. What a day. I skip home the night before all happy. I come here thinking I'm gonna get Haman hanged on this thing I built, Mordecai hanged. And now at lunchtime, this ain't so good. So he's full of confusion at first and then fear. So let's kind of wrap up the chapter, or at least this part of it. The king goes out, he's really annoyed, he's angry. He goes out to the garden, I guess that's where he goes to do his thinking and walking, and what am I gonna do about this? He comes in a little bit later, and what Haman's been doing is begging for his life with Esther. So they must have had like a couch or what are those things called that you kind of lay
Divan.
on?
Yes.
Huh?
A divan.
Whatever, a chaise lounge kind of thing. And she's probably sitting at one side. I'm picturing this is not scripture.
It says it was a couch.
A couch. And so she's probably sitting there and Haman is hanging all over this couch. So he's falling down, but he's like over the couch, probably right next to her, just begging. The king comes walking back in and sees Haman right next to his queen. And the first thing that comes to his mind is, wow, this guy's not only wicked, but he's wanting to do harm to my queen because of it. Maybe he's trying to rectify by getting rid of her or something, and he just kind of loses it. He doesn't really lose it, but right at that very moment, it says, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered his face, Haman's face. So they took him out right then, and he knows his goose is cooked. But anyway, the one of the eunuchs again, who probably favored Esther for the last number of years, in verse 9, listen, king, got a little tidbit for you that you probably didn't know. Haman, his enemies to Mordecai that you just honored, well, he had built a gallows outside of his house. He was going to hang Mordecai on it. And he says something similar to, well, maybe we shouldn't let that thing go to waste there, king. Might as well get some use out of it. I don't know if that's what he said, but I just picture it, right?
75 feet high.
Yeah, 50 cubits.
Yeah.
I mean, he wanted everybody to see it. And the king said, one sentence, 4 words, hang him on it. So all the king said, hang him on it. And it's done, right? So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. So I gave you a little bit of a French lesson early on about denouement. Let me give you one. I don't know if this is French. It's actually probably not. This is from Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. And he has I'm not going to go through the story, but he has a protagonist and an antagonist like they all do, right? And at the end, the antagonist gets it. And how he gets it is a particularly interesting story, which we won't go into. But have you ever heard the phrase hoisted on his own petard?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the hoisted by his own petard. You're about to learn a very valuable lesson here, Josh. I just love this kind of stuff. A petard was like a big grenade. It was an old-fashioned thing in the 1500s, and they would place it like right outside of a castle, like to blow the doors off or to blow a hole in it so they could attack, right? And so they light the thing and it blows up, and then they can gain entry. And to be hoisted on your own petard basically means it blows up in your own hands, and you get hoisted means you get blown up by this very thing that you intend to attack the enemy with. Well, this is just the perfect place to use that saying, if anybody who's ever heard it. Because think about it for a minute. What it basically means, the new definition, means to be caught in your own trap or ruined by the very scheme you devised to harm someone else. Well, I don't know how many places in my life I'm ever going to be able to use hoisted by his own petard, but I can use it here, because there is no story in the world that's better suited to that saying, right? So that's what happens to Haman. He gets hoisted by his own petard, hung by his own gallows that he built for Mordecai. And so God is continuing the story. So let's kind of summarize the rest. The rest is There's some things in it, but it's not as, I don't think, as dramatic as maybe it is. So in Esther chapter 8, you know, the decree still stands. Oh, I forgot this part. Hang on. I was a whole slide behind. This is what it means to be hoisted by your own petard. He built it for Mordecai. He gets hung on it himself. Ooh, not so good. So he continues to turn the tables. So now let's talk about what happens in the big picture. So the reversal gets completed in the rest of the chapters, in chapter 8 and chapter 9. At this point, that decree is still in place. So something's still got to happen. Esther's not really completed the salvation of the people. Well, God hasn't completed the salvation of the people through her. So here's the great reversal that happens. She does another kind of request. So she approaches him after all this has happened. I think it's probably the same day. And she said, listen, Esther goes to him and says, listen, I'm paraphrasing this part, but it's in chapter 8. Mordecai's my cousin. I think she says something like, my parents died when I was young or younger, and Mordecai took me in, and he's been raising me. And so we're Jewish, right? So she reveals who she is. And then in verse 5 of chapter 8, if it pleases the king, again, look at the two words that are happening. One is the humility, okay, which he approaches him, and then you're going to hear the same word we keep bringing up. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight. I mean, she's laying it on. If all of this is true, then let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. So she basically now is able to approach. Haman's out of the way, and she's like, listen, I need you to, she uses the word revoke. I need you to just take this away and save us, But what happens? Is it just revoking?
No, you can't revoke. It's, once he had said it.
He can't revoke it?
It could not be revoked, so he did the next best thing.
Right. So, I'm not sure if I'm going to read much more of that part, but you're right. So what happens is, she had used what I talked about before, the patience, and the wisdom and the thoughtfulness of how to approach it, and she hits them just at the right time. I wrote down this, and I don't know where this came from, but probably from God, but she was courageous, but she was not wildly courageous. She was wisely courageous. And I talked about this earlier, about sometimes courage calls for like an immediate burst of action. Often courage requires wisdom and calmness and having God unfold it before you, because you don't really know what to do. Just take the step that he asked you to take. So she didn't charge in on that first approach, where she thought she might perish. And she didn't after the first banquet. She waited she didn't even do it at the second banquet. She waited for after the whole thing with Haman was taken care of, when Mordecai had been brought back through God's hidden hand. And then she reaches and she comes in. So it's not courage does not mean recklessness. It doesn't just mean flying off the handle. I'm not going to share that. Something happened in my family later that's a pretty good illustration, but I shouldn't share it. So she asks for the revoking of the decree. But look at what happens in verse 8. Now, write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name. This is to Mordecai, actually. And seal it with the signet ring that he just gave him. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be revoked. So the king gives Mordecai the opportunity to write the new decree. So what Mordecai writes with, I'm sure, divine wisdom is, they can turn the tables on the 13th day of the 12th month, and they can destroy their enemies all across the whole kingdom, across the whole empire. And that decree gets sent out. You know, Ephesians 3:20, we like this verse and we use it. It says, he's able to do far more, abundantly beyond all that we can ask or think. All they wanted was to save their people. God did way more than that. He gave them a power that they didn't have. He raised Mordecai to the second in the kingdom. He allowed them to vanquish their enemies, not just in Susa, but all across the kingdom by creating a second decree. I mean, God works not just in ways we don't see, but in abundant ways that make what we thought was the resolution. How many times have you ever thought God was going to solve something one way and he solved it a different way, and it was a way better way than you thought? That's how he works, and that's exactly what happens in this story. So again, a reversal happens. God preserves his people. He not just saves them, but he increases their position. Look at verse 17 in chapter 8. It says, in each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Look at the second part. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews. He didn't use it to just save those people. He increased the kingdom of his own kingdom through it, right? And look at the last part. For the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. This goes back to what Gail was saying earlier about the Haman's wife. If he's a Jew, we got a problem, right? Because we see that he's in the midst of it. And the events might happen fast, but they're not going to end good for us.
You know, this seems to be God's way. The story of the Hebrews was a long story of suffering, as we learn from history. But it seems that each time they were captured as a people, that they somehow were allowed to live their lives in the midst of their captors.
Yeah.
When I watched The Chosen, the Romans tolerated the Jewish way of life, but it became popular back in Rome for senators to say, why are we letting the Jewish tell us how to conduct our affairs? You know? And it seems like the same kind of story is being told here in Babylon, and the same kind of story was told in Egypt. And God provided for his people to survive and continue onward. It's remarkable.
So I want to edit just a little bit. To wrap up 8 and 9. So at the end of 8, there's this, joy. There's a verse, and I didn't look it up, but there's a verse that talks about joy for sadness. That there might, and I can't remember, what's the thing about
Ashes.
something comes into the night and joy comes in the morning?
Yeah, that's in the Psalms.
Yeah. So this is what God has done, right? He has brought joy for sadness. They were just, previously in sackcloth and ashes and pleading for their life and dreading the fact that they were in big trouble. And he brings joy from it. So that's just another part of the reversal. So deliverance replaces despair. I want to bring up one little thing going back to the 1 Samuel story about King Saul and Agag and Samuel. So chapter 9, as you move into it, it's basically got two themes. The first one is really just the story about what happened. They were able throughout Susa and throughout all the provinces to wipe out a whole bunch of enemies. Matter of fact, they took out in verse 10, they killed and destroyed 500 people in Susa, including the 10 sons of Haman, the Jews' enemy. But look at the end of verse 10. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. In other words, the decree let them take whatever they wanted. Take care of your enemies and take whatever you want. Well, look what happens in 10. They didn't lay their hands on the plunder. If you look at verse 15, the Jews who were in Susa killed 300 men in Susa, but what? They didn't lay their hands on the plunder. Look at verse 16. Now the Jews out in the other provinces killed 75,000 through all the other provinces and 126 other ones. But look at the last verse, or last part of the verse. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. You remember how this whole thing started hundreds of years ago with Agag the Amalekite and King Saul and Samuel, right? And for whatever reason, God just wanted to wipe the Amalekites out, and he told Saul, wipe them all out. Don't leave anybody alive. Don't take any of their stuff. I don't want any trace of them around. Well, Saul didn't follow that. Caused hundreds of years of conflict because some Amalekites got away. He didn't kill Agag, even though he was supposed to. Samuel took care of him. But they also took some of the plunder. They took some of the goats and the sheep and the cattle and all of the stuff that they wanted. And Saul tried to blame the people for doing that, but he's the king. He could have said don't. So all these hundreds of years later, Haman, who's a descendant of Agag, of the Amalekites, gets eradicated. He gets eradicated. All of his sons are gone. Probably the whole family. I mean, I don't think there was ever another Agagite descendant alive after this. Maybe there were some others in the rest of Persia, and those got taken care of too. We don't know. But did the Jews did it right this time. They had the right to take the plunder. They could have done it, and they didn't. We don't understand exactly why. But I think they probably at this point had made a connection in their mind that this is an eradication of a group of people that are our enemies. And when God has told us to do that before, he's told us don't take anything. So we're not taking anything. I just find the symmetry there really interesting.
How are they able to kill all those people?
Well, I don't know. That's one of those questions for heaven. I don't know why. First of all, we're just going to leave this hanging. The one question that I still have is if the king issues a decree that all the Jews in the kingdom are going to be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month, why aren't they gone? What kept them there? Why would you stay? The only thing I can think of is they just had faith that it wasn't going to happen, that God wasn't going to let it happen. Because if it's me and my family, and the king says, Dan and his wife are going to be gone, in 3 months. Well, I'm going to be gone before that. I don't know where I'm going to go, but I'm not going to stay. But they didn't. And it's kind of the same thing here with how did all those people get killed by the Jews who were a small minority? I don't know.
Well, didn't it say in the passage that
Help me.
many of the people who were not Jews joined with the Jews
Yep.
because they
That's true.
knew these guys were
Yeah.
going to get with them or not be against them.
So maybe it was such an influx that they became a significant, group.
Yeah,
Well,
verse
you can imagine that even people in the king's,
verse 16 says they got relief from their enemies
Yeah,
and killed 75,000.
yeah. I mean, there are some things that the Bible says, but we don't fully understand. I mean, I don't think it's that huge of a deal, but I don't really know why they would be able to do that. Now, when you think about 127 provinces, 75,000 divided by 125 is, they weren't all in one place. It's not like they had 75,000 of them, they rounded them up in the Colosseum and they just, machine gunned them.
Right.
It was done in pockets, but, I don't really know. So there's one other thing I want to cover, two more things. One in chapter 9, and this is going to be kind of an aside, but I don't think we can go through the book without talking about it. And that's the concept of Purim. So we read before that Mordecai had said, we're going to do a feast. We're going to have a feast on the 14th day. We're going to do all of this, and then we're going to honor God. We had been in sackcloth and ashes. Now we're going to have a celebration, right? So in chapter 9, it starts in verse 20. And Mordecai establishes in verse 21, celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day annually. And we're not going to go into the details of the whole thing, but they established an annual celebration to remember, a time of remembrance that God had delivered them. And the Jews are really good at this, right? To this day, they're good at it. Do you know that they still do this on their calendar on the 14th or 15th day of Adar? They still do it. It's been 2,500 years. And if you walk into a synagogue on that day, they read the book of Esther, the whole thing, start to finish. And they do feasts, and they give food to each other, and they help poor people, and they've been doing it for 2,500 years. You know, we're celebrating our 250th anniversary this year in America. This is 10 times longer than the traditions that we have as America, that we celebrate. And they're still doing it, and they pass it down. You know, when this happened, it wasn't easy to pass stuff down. There wasn't an internet. They would pass this down to their children and their children and their children. And they had this way of keeping the faith that they believed in alive generation to generation. And I think the application for us is we need to be the same way. Just about when God does great things for us, we need to celebrate those things and pass them down to each other and pass them down to our children and grandchildren and be intentional about not forgetting all the great things he's done. He's done so many great things in the 30 years I've been in this church. And we don't really bring them up and talk about him and celebrate him. And I'm not talking here, I want to just be clear, I'm not talking here about setting a date and having a ceremony and doing a traditional thing. You know, the New Testament that we live in says that we don't have to celebrate days and weeks and all these different things. We don't have to do days like that. But as our life, we really should be about sharing what he's doing in our lives and the deliverance he's given us and the things he's done. So just remember this story. Remember that that's a part of it, is that they remembered it, and they still do.
Yeah. Part of the celebration is for an older person to tell the story and for the children to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they do it again the next year, the children will say, we did this last year.
Mm-hmm.
And they begin to learn the story. And then one day they become the adult that tells the story to new children.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to tell you a story about something in our family that we do kind of like that, but I don't think it's time to do that. So to end us up, there's one more chapter, chapter 10. What is something that you notice about chapter 10, just if you look at it briefly? Anything? This is an aside. I can't help but do these occasionally.
It's about Mordecai.
Yeah, but look, it's 3 verses.
Sure.
It's about it depends on how you count. Some people count by verses, some people count by the number of words in a chapter. You can look at it different ways. But it's in the top 5 shortest chapters in the whole Bible. Total aside, doesn't mean anything. I don't know why. But at any rate, it is about Mordecai being lifted to the second in the kingdom, and it talks about his greatness throughout his life. And let's just end with verse 3, which is, I think, a fitting end. The book of Esther doesn't end with Esther, it ends with Mordecai. You know? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to the king, and great among the Jews, and here's that word, the whole book gets wrapped up in the last verse, and in favors throughout this whole thing. And we talked about it at the beginning. Favor is not something that we can make happen. Favor is something that God allows to happen in our lives. In favor with his many kinsmen, and look at the last phrase. This is who he was. He wasn't in this to become second in the kingdom or about his glory. We talked about how the Persians were all worried about their own glory and their own, He was one who sought the good of his people and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. That's a pretty good thing to be known for 2,500 years later, right? That's who we should be. We shouldn't be about, in this church, what am I doing? Who am I in this thing? It's not about who's where. It's about how can I serve in this body to the good of everybody else? And how can you do the same thing? It's not about who rises and who doesn't. It's not about position. It's about the growth of his kingdom. And Mordecai understood that from the very beginning, even when he seemed to be a minor part of the story. Now, Esther's still the main character. I'm not trying to say that. But Mordecai has a bigger place in this than we would have certainly thought. So what do we learn? Quick recap. Well, we don't need to say this. It all got reversed. What have we learned? He works when he seems silent. We don't need to repeat this too much. Courage sometimes means not just obedience, but it might cost you something, and it's uncertain, and fear happens, and you do it anyway. because we know that he is for us even in the midst of it. So we have to conquer that fleshly side of us that has fear and walk forward in faith anyway. And then he can reverse any situation. I want to just kind of end with this. You know, we read these stories. Sometimes God reverses situations like this. Sometimes he doesn't reverse them. Sometimes he walks through them with us. He doesn't reverse it. It's something that we need to walk through. Now, he's always there with us. He never leaves us or forsakes us. But he needs us to learn something through the experience, and he walks through it with us, and he doesn't resolve it necessarily. And sometimes it's a test, really, I think, because he knows that sometimes when I obey, if there's a cost to it, if it becomes, I need courage, sometimes I might fail that. I mean, Esther could have failed it. Mordecai knew even if Esther failed it, God would redeem it anyway. But Esther could have failed in that. So sometimes God puts us in places that require obedience and courage, knowing that we might fail, and then giving us another opportunity later on. So sometimes when he's putting us through things, it's kind of a test. But here's the last thing. If it'll click two more times. God's name is never mentioned, but his hand is everywhere in this story. I would summarize it in one sentence that's more of I think a New Testament kind of thing. We've said this before, but the summary of this to me is even when we can't see his hand, we can trust his heart. They knew God's heart, even though he didn't show up in a prophet or a miracle. And we can trust him too, even though our courage or our obedience is not life or death. We can trust his heart and that it's good for us even when we don't feel it. So that's pretty much it. Thanks everybody for listening. My big AI slide, isn't that cool? His name's never mentioned, but his hand's everywhere. So let me ask any questions or any comments or whatever about the series, anything that you either have insight into or want to ask that wasn't clarified, or are we wrapped here? I don't want to close the door. Did I answer your question kind of through the whole thing? Okay, good.
I'll go back to the
Yep.
part where, Tim questioned how in the world did they do that? Well, the history of the Jewish nation and their battles was he would take small, insignificant numbers and do amazing things through means that you wouldn't expect. Like, remember the one army that had very few, they narrowed them all down and they surrounded the enemy who was way outnumbered.
Gideon, yeah.
On the hillsides and made all this noise and commotion.
And
And the enemies got so confused that they turned on themselves and wiped themselves out.
Yeah.
And in this case, in chapter 9, verse 2, it says, the Jews assembled in their cities throughout the provinces of the king to attack those who sought to harm them. And no one could stand against them because the dread of them had fallen on all the people. So they had all become so afraid that they knew every time someone messed with the Jews that God showed up and they were done.
Yeah.
And so the fear of them all had fallen on all the peoples. And it says, even all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business were supporting the Jews in this.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
their dread of God had fallen on all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
God again worked in an unseen way
Yeah.
to
Right.
accomplish what he wanted.
That's right.
And I imagine it like a wave, because again, no internet, no fast connection, no fast. It's just like this information is just kind of like the first edict went out, and it's a wave of oh my gosh, and then like the second edict, and then you can just kind of see it
Yeah.
settling across all of Persia.
Did the king really say that? Let me read that. And then, oh boy. Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts or comments?
One question would be, they say that in every book of the Bible that you can see the story of Christ as Messiah. Where is that story in this story?
Salvation of God's people.
I mean, redemption of yeah. I mean, through really nothing that they did other than courage. I mean, God did it all, and he did it in an unseen way. And then there's this point of a decision, right? I think it's kind of that.
Mordecai's obedience not to put somebody above God. Mordecai's, willingness to sacrifice himself for that, and then God lifting him up to be exalted at the right side of the king. That's
Right.
number two.
So Mordecai's kind of a type of Christ in that way.
You also were talking about the word favor,
Mm-hmm.
and it made me think of these 3 verses from Luke. It says, and the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God.
Mm-hmm.
And the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man.
Mm-hmm. You know, we chase a lot of things in our world, you know, to make us comfortable or to kind of improve our lives. I don't know that there's anything in the world that quite compares with having God's favor on you. And we have it. I mean, that's something that is really kind of blows my mind, is because he loves us so much and all he's done for us, we're his children. We have his favor. A lot of times we don't maybe necessarily walk in it, but we have it. So that's a pretty great ending too. So Tim, could you stop the thing for a second? Go ahead and stop it. Okay. So let's just